Let's add a new file to our project, and we'll call this file, so this is going to be a Swift file, and we'll name this Dark Sky API Client. The class we're going to define here, which let me add it in. So the class is also Dark Sky API Client, and this class will have a single responsibility, and that is to interact with the Dark Sky API and get us back the current weather in the form of a populated model instance. Before we can do that, the class needs a few bits of information to allow it to construct a query. First, we need to store our API key. Previously, we put that in the view controller as a file private property. Let's add that as a stored property to our new class. So go over to view controller. I'm going to copy this for now. And we'll go back to Dark Sky API Client and paste it in here. The next property we want to create is the base URL that we'll be using to interact with the Dark Sky API. That way, every time we want to make a call, we can create a URL relative to this base and save us some work. Let's create this property as a lazy stored property that is assigned a value from a closure. So lazy var base URL of type URL, and to this we're going to assign a closure that we call immediately. Inside the closure, we'll return an instance of URL that takes a string, and here I'm just going to go back and copy the string to make sure that I make no mistakes. Oops, there we go. Now, you'll see that I have an error here. It says this is not unwrapped. Remember, this is a failable initializer, but since we pretty much think that, we have the right URL, let's go ahead and force unwrap. Now, you'll notice that, despite both of these being stored properties, I can actually access the Dark Sky API key stored property from inside here, and that is because this is a lazy property that is actually created some point after initialization. Now, regarding this force unwrap, we're actually okay with this because if this doesn't work, right, if we have an incorrect URL, we actually want this to crash because we want to catch that early on. We don't want the app to just stay inactive because our base URL, the thing that handles all the network calls, is incorrect. We'll add one more stored property, the last one here, and that is to hang on to an instance of the downloader, which is the JSON downloader class we wrote earlier. Now here we're just using the convenience initializer to specify a default session configuration. Like JSON downloader, Dark Sky API Client is going to have a single focus, just one method in the class that interacts with the API and returns either an error or a populated instance of current weather. Let's call this method getCurrentWeather. But before we write that bit of code, let's define a new type. The URL we used earlier had a location fixed at Alcatraz Island, and that's what we're going to use for the rest of this course. Even though the location is fixed, we don't want to write our code that way. So for this method we're about to define, we're going to allow the caller to provide the user's location as an argument. This way, if you want to specify your own hard-coded location, or if you want to actually implement location code, you won't have to change your client code in any way. When using the Dark Sky API, we specify what location we want to get the weather for by providing as arguments the user's latitude and longitude to pinpoint their coordinates on this planet. These values are just added to the end of the URL. And if we go back to the view controller class, you can see how we constructed the URL with these values. For the fetch current weather method, we could just define a coordinate argument as a tuple with two double values. But I like small types since we can add some functionality on top of them to reduce errors and make our code more convenient. So let's add a new file. We'll call this coordinate. And in here, we'll declare a struct of the same name. This type will be fairly simple and just model a user's coordinate by storing values for the latitude and longitude. So let latitude, and we'll say let longitude. Now, this is all we need from a data perspective. When we're constructing our URL, though, we need to take these double values and make a string out of it. We can do that using string interpolation in our function, but we can improve upon that by delegating the work to the type itself. So in an extension to coordinate, let's add conformance to custom string convertible. So the requirements for this protocol are that we provide a computed or stored property named description that returns a string describing the instance. So here we'll say description and it should autocomplete. And for this description, we're going to return a string containing the latitude and longitude values in the format we need. So we can say return, and in here we'll use string interpolation and we'll say latitude, comma, and then the longitude. Now we can even do one more thing. To make it easier, we can declare a static computed property named Alcatraz, if I'm spelling that right, Alcatraz Island, and this returns a coordinate instance, and here we'll return coordinate, and we need the values for the latitude and longitude. I'm going to go back to the view controller and grab these values and then paste them in here. So the first one is the latitude, and then the second one is the longitude. Now, instead of just writing that out using strings or creating an instance of coordinate where I pass in the values, I can just use this convenient computed property so that we can test our code. Okay, back in the API client, so Dark Sky API client, let's define our method. We'll start simple. So func get current weather at coordinate of type coordinate. But that's not all. Since this method is going to be calling methods that are asynchronous closure-based methods, we need to provide a completion handler for this method as well so that we can provide some code to execute in the background whenever the work is complete. We'll give this argument an external name of completion handler and a local name of completion, just like before. Like the previous closure we defined, since this closure is also executed after the body of this function is executed, we need to specify that this closure is escaping. Now for this completion handler, what kind of data are we returning to the call site? The goal of this method is to end up with either a populated instance of current weather or an error. So the arguments here would be current weather and dark sky error. And just like in the previous case, we can't have both arguments containing non-null values at any given point, so we need to make both of them optional. Finally, the return type of this closure is void. Let's take a break here. Before we end this video though, I want to highlight one quick thing. If these closure signatures are a bit much for you and your method just seems really long here, you can clean things up by using a type alias. For example, with this closure, let's create a type alias called current weather completion or completion handler, and we can define it as a closure type. So here I'm going to say the type is current weather, optional, to dark sky error, optional, and return type of void. Now you can get rid of this here and just specify that the argument type is current weather completion handler, and it should make it a bit more readable. So we can go back to JSON downloader and we can do the same. So here we have a completion handler, right, that accepts an argument of optional JSON, optional dark sky error, and returns void. Let's define another type alias. We'll call it JSON task completion handler. And we'll just copy everything up to void here, get rid of it, paste it in, and then here we'll say JSON task completion handler. Okay, in the next video, let's tackle the body of this method.